be pleased to know that it won't be me doing the majority of the talking today. We've got a guest, Kieran Hunt, who's the company planning manager at Alec. Thanks for joining us, Kieran.
Hi, Seb. Yeah, nice to be here today.
Looks like we're ready to go. So firstly, Kieran, thanks for joining us. If you could just tell us a bit about kind of Alec and the projects you do and the kind of scale of them and your role.
Yeah, okay. So, hi everybody. I'm Kieran Hunt. I'm the company planning manager with Alec, and I've been with them now for 7 years. I've been working 11 years in the Middle East in total, and over 20 years in the industry. I joined Alec back in 2013 on a very large airport project, which was an additional concourse at Dubai Airport. That's kind of a typical job for Alec. Alec have celebrated 20 years last year. I think within 7 years of starting up, they were $1 billion turnover industry. So it's been a company that's grown very rapidly. And in the last 10 years, they've typically turned over $1 billion a year. They tend to focus on large mega projects, complex projects, and areas where we can bring our expertise to the fore. And we don't tend to do a lot of repetitious type work or the standard housing. We tend to focus, as I say, on large like shopping malls, hotel complexes, theme parks, that type of thing, high rise, and airport infrastructure.
Okay, so today's webinar topic is kind of the effect of COVID-19 and the outlook on the industry. So what I want to do is I want to take you back to a few months ago when COVID-19 was just kind of being mentioned. So let's take it back to before there were any real cases in the UAE and before any kind of lockdown measures were in place. What were kind of Alex's response to it then, or was it a case of just not doing anything until basically lockdown measures came in, or how did it happen there?
Yeah, so I suppose the world kind of watched on as it was happening in China and Italy in the months of February and early March. I think it was apparent in early March that things were going to change, but nobody really knew exactly what was going to happen. I myself had only flown to the UK for a weekend, and that was in the middle of March. I'm still in the UK. I'm not able to fly back to Dubai yet. So it happened quite quickly, I suppose, over the week between the 12th and the maybe 21st of March is when we actually understood what COVID-19 was going to do to the industry. We had in the UAE, there was the ministry set up an initial thing to alert people as to the new restrictions. I think daily restrictions were being announced, and these were mandated across the entire country. Then within the UAE, obviously the 7 Emirates. Between the different Emirates, they also brought out their own specific criteria and restrictions, and it became, it really was overnight that all of a sudden, working became really difficult.
Yeah. Okay. So that's all in place now. The kind of lockdown measures have been put in and restrictions in place. What was the immediate impact on kind of your kind of sites and the working environment?
So I suppose the immediate impact really was felt more by clients and maybe our supply chain, where they weren't quite sure how to react. So we had clients and consultants that didn't want to come to site anymore, even though the government was saying that construction needed to remain operating at all times. And during COVID-19, we haven't really lost any day on any job. We've been working every day to some extent, with a reduced capacity at times. But as a contractor, our guys were going to site still working. Our labour was going to site. We were carrying on works as best as we could. Every time a new regulation came out, we reacted to it. I think Alec were very good at the very beginning to try and preempt a lot of this stuff. So Alec straight away set up a kind of a core team of people to deal with COVID-19. They met daily. They set up in head office. They kind of worked out worst case scenarios from day one and how they would deal with each of these events. So they put in place a lot of procedures, I'd say within the first 2 or 3 days of the lockdown, so that we knew how to react when the next kind of level of restriction came. We also decided to get our IT department to set up a database for all our employees and workers, so staff and workers. So that's over 13,000 people logged into a system where we recorded who our primary contacts were over the last previous 14 days, and it was going to be renewed regularly, and also who all our detailed information, so names, addresses, who we were living with, all that kind of information was brought up to date. And it was a massive effort. The guys worked 24/7 to get all this data in place really quickly, so that if somebody was diagnosed with COVID or suspected of having COVID, immediately we could identify the primary contacts and only take those select people out of the business because they needed to quarantine. And that was the biggest effect. I suppose a lot of our labour live in provided accommodation, so it was really important that we were able to trace that very quickly and limit the impact it had on our workforce.
Wow, so it seems like you guys were very kind of forward thinking and kind of proactive rather than reactive. From your background, obviously you're in charge of multiple different projects and kind of the planners all over those projects. What was the main kind of issues you faced from a planning point of view when this first all kicked off?
Yeah, so I suppose I'd say a lot of what planners do is generally, it's online. So our databases and servers are all either cloud-based or we're connected via Wi-Fi to different systems. So a lot of my guys were able to say work from home quite quickly, and it's something we're used to doing as planners. We're used to bringing our laptop home with us and working from home from time to time. I myself I'm always quite mobile between the sites, so the fact that I had to work from the UK rather than an office didn't really have any impact on my day-to-day workload. I think as planners, our biggest issue was to overcome was communication and connectivity to the rest of the team, and to bring the site back to everybody else who was working remotely. So a lot of the staff who would need to go to site on a daily basis, all of a sudden there was massive restrictions on how many people could go, social distancing, etc. And that was a challenge for us as planners, because we do work hand in hand with the operations team. So we're not just a reporting function; we're actively capturing data, forecasting programs, and that had to continue for the construction to carry on.
Okay. What we've kind of found on many of our projects working in and around the UK, I'm not sure if it's the same there, where kind of people have kind of taken on more responsibilities during this time, or they've had a kind of change in roles. Has that happened too much out there?
I think there was, so some of the things that we used to do on the site, we had to either delegate that work to people who were still on site. So people who were going to site regularly probably ended up having to do other things than what they were normally used to doing on a daily basis, because so few people could come to site. So things like site walks became pretty much impossible. We tried to limit the number of people that had to travel. So Alec, as a company, we're quite good at making sure that people did work remotely. There was no pressure on anybody to go to work if it wasn't necessary. And I think because of that, there was definitely, people didn't end up doing slightly different roles or stuff that were slightly out of their normal day-to-day work.
Okay. So we've touched upon kind of the impact, but let's go kind of, and you've already said a few bits about how you kind of responded. In terms of health and safety on site, what were kind of the responses there? Again,
I suppose the health and safety, because of the pandemic issue, which is something that no industry is used to dealing with, it takes it to a different level. So it's no longer the kind of the normal stuff of falls from a height or near misses or the things that normally happen on a day-to-day basis on site. Whilst that still happened and it was still had to be dealt with, it was now a case of treating from a health point of view, worst our workforce at risk, was there subcontractors at risk, and just basically creating welfare facilities that allowed our guys to social distance so that we did minimize person-to-person contact. A lot of our guys go to work on company provided transport like buses, so we had to review our whole logistics, and I think safety had a big part to play in all of that, to advise people to make sure that whatever we were putting in place was adequate and met the requirements.
Okay. So you've mentioned kind of obviously you and the planners are used to working from home. But do you think kind of going forward there'll be a bit more of a change in policy to allow people from working from home wherever possible?
Yeah, I think until there's a vaccine found for COVID, there's a risk that localized lockdowns or restrictions may be re-implemented at any stage. And I suppose as a company, we need to be able to deal with that. And our management have been very good at kind of putting together this team to focus on, as people call it, the new normal, where it's not necessarily everybody has to go to the office anymore. We're trying to still encourage people to work remotely where possible. And going forward, I think we've been asked, the company's asked every employee to give feedback, and we've had some surveys done to see what work they could do remotely. Okay, there's certain aspects, obviously, when you're in construction that you need to be there for, but what's the workaround on those, or how do we still carry on our works and productivity whilst adhering to the regulations?
Okay. So we talked about kind of the immediate impact, but looking longer term now, what do you think? What were the kind of strategic changes made over the last 3 months, looking further forward into the future? So, how do you think it will affect kind of procurement and the resources and supply chain?
Yeah, I think obviously the effects of the manufacturing industry are not necessarily being felt on site just yet, because we had enough materials to keep us going, and the supply chain had stock. But I think, where possible, if we had ordered something from overseas, we tried to source that more locally, or substitute to keep the job going. I think the impact as a supply chain might be felt later in the year, where stock does dry up, because a lot of these factories have had to close for certain periods, and any stockpiled material may well have been depleted by now. So it may be a case of lead-in times increase, and the logistics for these things are still uncertain. So traveling between countries, we get materials from all over the world, and it's part of what we do in the planning is to understand how these materials get delivered through the ports and the process of getting them to site. We have some isolated incidences where things have been disrupted and delayed, but generally speaking, we've been quite lucky that things have kept moving.
Yeah. Okay. So let's just say you pick up a new project now. In terms from a tendering point of view and from planning for that project, how much of an impact is COVID-19 having? So say there's no immediate vaccine, is this affecting how you plan for the project or your tender process?
Look, at the moment, I suppose most of the tenders we're dealing with at the moment, they would have come about from clients and consultants earlier in the year, pre-COVID-19. So we're dealing with durations and contracts that are based on that, not necessarily dealing with a disruptive nature of a pandemic. I think probably what's been noticed more in the contracts is that where different elements of the industry are asking for certain conditions to be added into contracts to deal with the kind of pandemic situation, if it was to happen again. But generally speaking, we're tendering as normal. We're not really making any major allowance for a disruption. And I think that's mainly because in the Middle East that we did manage to keep the construction industry, pretty much going as it was, with the support of the government, actually, so they whilst they brought restrictions into other industries, they made sure that the construction industry was able to carry on as normal as possible.
Okay. And what are your kind of longer term kind of strategic changes in terms of the operations of Alec?
I think the digital aspect of what we were doing. So before COVID, a lot of the stuff we were doing in terms of digital initiatives were seen as a nice to have. I think what the lockdown situation and the restrictions meant is that it was now a necessity to have this software, and I think there's a lot of positives from it, from my point of view, in terms of the digital initiatives that we had introduced. Luckily, we were up and running with most of them pre-COVID, so we knew how to kind of use them to an extent where they would benefit the company. But what happened was we had such a huge demand on these softwares for the last 3 months. It has really brought forward the dependency on these, and you can see that it was kind of a necessary kind of a kick in the right direction to get our industry moving that way. So I think there's a lot of positives in terms of that type of thing that's definitely come about. As I say, sometimes it takes something like that just to upset the industry and get people thinking in a different way.
Yeah, I read recently that they reckon COVID-19 is one of the biggest digital disruptors to ever happen. But we'll come back more into kind of digitalization a bit later on. But what's the situation currently on your sites?
So currently our staff in the last probably week are coming back to site again, but only as I say, the ones that need to come, that are necessary to come. We're still encouraging a lot of the admin side of things, and the guys who are doing the more kind of site-based roles or site office-based roles to still work remotely where possible. I would say of my planning team, it's probably 50% are back on site again on a regular basis, with the other 50.
Oh. I think you just cut out there, Kieran.
Sorry, I
think you just cut out.
Yeah, I was just saying that there's about 50% of my planners working remotely, with the rest of them now back on site again. So we are looking at trying to see how we would maybe have people working partially from home at times, because we've seen that people can be more productive when they're working on stuff like planning and programming, and the more kind of office-based type work can be done more efficiently if you have the right setup at home to do so.
Yeah. And what's the situation on site in terms of restrictions? Is there still social distancing and PPE?
So I think in the UAE, they mandated the use of a lot of PPE straight away. So our guys have been wearing gloves and masks basically since March. I think we sourced something like 600,000 masks. It was a huge number. Maybe it was 100,000 masks. I got that number wrong, but it was a huge number. And we've been, they're disposable masks, so our guys use, several ones a day. As I say, we have about 13,000 staff or labour, so we do get through them quite quickly. But PPE changed, as I say, that mandate by the UAE government was probably quite forward thinking, because the rest of the world was saying masks and gloves are not maybe necessary. Our guys have been using them, since March, and it's become their norm. So it's facilitated. It's probably facilitated more people to be on site, and that the 2 meter rule, while it's obviously a mandate where possible, it's very difficult in construction to keep with the 2 meter rule. A lot of our guys work in gangs of 2 or 3, whether they be installing windows or doors or tilers or helpers with masons. It's just not practical. So the PPE situation has really alleviated that impact.
Yeah. How are you trying to get things back to normal? Obviously, there's going to be people working from home and a bit of disruption. How are you trying to get productivity back to where it was, or as close as it could be?
Yeah, it's a difficult thing. Obviously, the climate in Dubai, July and August. So June, July, August, September are probably the 4 hottest months, and with very high humidity. So typically those 4 months are generally really low in terms of productivity. It averages out over the year to a reasonable level, but going into the summer now, it's, as I say, we always see a decline. So it's difficult to see a massive impact on the productivity because we have been used to, say, working with PPE for the last 3 months. Yeah. And, I think it's probably put more of a strain on our logistics than anything else. We've had to increase welfare facilities, transport has had to increase, our accommodation for the guys. We've had to get on more accommodation to make sure that the isolating can be done as per the government requirements. So it's a difficult one in Dubai at the moment, just to see how productivity. I think what's happened is because the issues on site, what we've done is we've focused on key activities, and we've made sure that they've been productive. So maybe a month or two yet before we realise, from the other works, the massive loss of productivity, and then how we're going to ramp back up again. But those numbers are still not that obvious. As I say, we did focus most of our resource in keeping the longest path or critical activities moving in the right direction.
Okay. You touched upon it earlier in terms of your digital solutions and how you were digitalising construction. How big of an impact has that had on you guys, kind of being able to keep things open and running the last few months? And kind of what kind of solutions have you been using? Obviously, we've been working with you on a lot of your projects. But what else has kind of you've been working on that has been really? You mentioned your database, which I think is really innovative, and I haven't heard of anyone that's actually done that so far during COVID. But what else has been kind of happening?
So I suppose we've looked at a lot of things, and I think I'm lucky that Alec are such a forward-thinking company, and they really push innovation all the time. We've also been, so along with VisiLean, where we've been using the guys to update programs. We've had guys that have been involved in jobs, and because they're using something like VisiLean, they've been able to keep track of their project, even though they might be stuck in a remote location. So I, for example, even though I'm based in England, I can keep track on a daily basis what the guys are doing on site. That wouldn't have been possible before we did this. We've had project managers that have been stuck in South Africa or India or Pakistan or wherever. So they've also been able to have access to updates. So before, it would have been impossible for those guys to work remotely because they needed to be on site to see everything. I think the impact they can have in kind of the lean construction process and managing that whole thing through something like VisiLean has meant that they were able to work actually, and okay, there's certain things they can't do because they're not on site, but they were able to do, a lot of things, which was great. We've also looked at other 360-degree software, the progress captures. So we have a software that we use, and that was able to bring the site to the guys. So I was able to give access to, we'd do maybe 3 site walks a week, and all these 360-degree photographs are available on a web application, and they were able to access the site. So between the VisiLean showing them the breakdown of the work, and with the software with the 360 images, they're able to see exactly the progress and to be really involved in the job still. And again, we had guys had to self-quarantine because they were at risk, or it was the recommendation. So they were off possibly between 7 and 14 days. They weren't necessarily ill, so they didn't have any signs of symptoms of COVID. But because they were primary contacts, they were taken out of the workforce. Those guys in management were still able to be active on site and to be involved, which is great,
Yeah. So this is now your chance to kind of give your opinion on to kind of the rest of the industry. So what kind of suggestions would you give to the wider industry? Let's start with kind of your personal expertise in planning. So what suggestions would you give to the rest of the industry to cope in this situation or to get through it?
I suppose a big part of planning is communication. So it's important that you have the right systems in place to keep communication going. Planning is all about really once you put a plan in place, is communicating that plan. And from a planner's point of view, that's been the real kind of challenge. And I suppose going forward, it's something we're going to be a bit more aware of in terms of how we need to do this, and not to be reliant on one system, or that we need to have backup plans for this type of thing. So I suppose that's probably one thing that's probably something for the industry to look at, is going forward, how do we integrate the communication and the importance of that, to have a speedier kind of workflow, better communication within our systems that talk to each other and integrate is a big thing. And then just having reliable software, whether it's cloud-based or whatever, that, when it needs to work, it works every time. And, that kind of facilitates the work to continue.
Okay. And in terms of kind of, obviously you're predominantly working in the UAE, but at the moment you're back in the UK, so you've kind of seen the rules here and the restrictions in construction and things like that. So having seen how it's working in the UAE, and you've already mentioned that the sites have been able to kind of pretty much stay open, what's your opinion on how things are happening predominantly in the UK? We've still got social distancing. We didn't have really the PPE rule necessarily. What's your opinion on that?
Yeah, I suppose it's we were adhering to government regulations the whole time and mandates. So I think every day, I'd say for the first probably 5 or 6 weeks of the outbreak, every day we were getting a new government recommendation or a new regulation that had to be followed, and it was being policed really well, and people were responsible to abide by it. Each country has obviously had a different take on that. In the UK, obviously some companies closed their sites voluntarily for a couple of weeks to find out how they were going to deal with this, which was a good thing, I suppose. We didn't have that luxury, if you like, in terms of having to get a break to assess things and then find out how we were doing it. We were finding out in the evening that there was new regulation being brought in tomorrow morning. So we had those kind of issues to deal with, and for a while it was real firefighting, and we probably could have done with probably a period where we were able to just say, okay, let's just have a look at this and then react in a responsible way. I think in the UK, because you have a more skilled workforce, you tend to have fewer labour on site. We have very large numbers on site because our labour is generally less skilled. So I think because you have that more upskilled labour force, you do have fewer numbers probably per square metre on a job than we would. You also use a lot more kind of offsite manufacturing, which reduces the man hours on a job. So I can see that that's also helped to keep, when the construction sites reopened again, things just carried on. And I think that's probably a big difference in the industry. I suppose there's a lot more offsite manufacturing and modular or precast type situations where that can be done in a factory. And with the fewer man hours on site, then it's tended to have it. It's probably had different issues for the guys on site here than we've had.
Yeah. We've worked with you across a couple of places in the UAE. How have you found, have the rules kind of changed between different kind of nations you're working with there, or how's it been?
Yeah, so we have large projects. We're working in Abu Dhabi on a large theme park. We have 4 projects down at the Expo site in Dubai. We also have some large residential projects that we're doing, and a couple of big malls. What we found is that between the Emirates, so it's basically like two different counties, we'll say, in England, having different regulations. So when you go over the border, you're into different regulations. So we've had those kind of restrictions imposed on us. So in Dubai at the moment, for example, you're able to freely travel around the place, but to drive down the road to Abu Dhabi, you need to have a permit, and those permits are not being issued that freely. So our workforce are not necessarily getting from Dubai to Abu Dhabi anymore. So, and this is just in the last 7 days. Now it will lift again by the end of the month, but it's something, it means that it's each site has its own issues, and we've had to react differently in different areas. So at Dubai Airport, for example, they decided to close the airport fully. So we did a couple of small projects there while they, basically they cater for the COVID. But when it opened back up again, we're all back at work again. It's just, as I say, it's each site, client, and region has had its own challenges, and there's not really been that much consistency between how it's happened. But most of the restrictions have been for short periods, and then what resumes again.
Wow, I mean, in terms of just the scale of the projects, the scale of your workforce, it seems that everything's been such a huge thing to get sorted, but you've actually done it relatively quickly and well. Lastly, I'm going to ask you to use your crystal ball here and kind of give us your outlook for the future. It can be construction and kind of the UAE, how things will be done there.
Yeah, I think construction, you can see in the last couple of months, everybody's talking about digital and initiatives and working smarter, having more offsite manufacturing, reducing the number of man hours on a project, just to de-risk it for something like this happening again. And I suppose there'll be a combination of all those things, globally happening. But at the same time, we're creatures of habit, and it doesn't take long after these restrictions will be, reduced or stopped. We'll soon kind of go back into our old ways again, I would imagine, for certain aspects. But I think the digital initiative is actually going to keep going, because I think a lot of people have seen during the lockdown the benefits of working online, being more efficient, traveling less, spending more quality time in meetings or in workshops, and just being able to cover more work, basically, which when you're site based or office based and having to travel to projects, or when you're on a project and having to go to site regularly, if there's stuff that can reduce some of that and make you more productive as a person on a site, no matter what you're doing, those initiatives will, I think they're going to really benefit from this, and you will see a lot more emphasis going forward on this type of thing, and it'll probably make its way into contracts as well there, where they will request that a lot of these digital initiatives are mandated by the client and utilised on a project. And I think that's quite positive, because it's a lot of this technology has been around for a long time, and it's just needed the right push to get it going,
Yeah. Well, that's pretty much all the topics I had for today. I'm going to open up, if you don't mind, just to a couple of questions.
Yeah, that's fine.
The attendees. Hopefully nothing comes out of left field. So if anyone wants to ask a question, you can just type it. I think I can turn on the Q&A mode here. Questions. Okay. So if you have a question, just type it in the text box and we'll fire it out to Kieran to answer. A few people typing. Also, just to let everyone know, obviously, this is the start of our second series of webinars, so there'll be more details to come out on that in the next few days, but you can register in advance for those sessions. We'll open that up soon, hopefully in the next week or so. So question number 1 from Deval: how are you dealing with construction material supply chain impacts?
Yeah, so I suppose this is on a case-by-case basis. So in some instances where we have materials held up either in factories because they've closed down due to the workforce, not being able to visit a factory or work in a factory for a couple of weeks, we've had to obviously inform the clients of these situations. We try and mitigate these issues where possible by maybe resequencing works, we've also looked at, being able to supplement that supply chain with local suppliers within the UAE, for example. And I suppose it's just a combination, but it's, obviously it's been felt by the supply chain. So we are, we do have to support these guys, and, we do try and deal with the situation, in as best as we can. But it's, as I say, we've not really suffered massively with the supply chain up until now, but that impact is likely to grow during the year as other countries open up looking for material. Then you're competing with other locations that are back in production again. So for a long time, maybe the UAE was probably one of the few areas where construction was continuing and requiring material. So as I say, now we will be dealing with being having to compete with the rest of the market for that same material.
Okay. We've got another one here. It's a long one. Originally, it's been noted that VisiLean works better on large projects as there are more resources and smaller projects not as beneficial. With COVID-19 causing remote working and issues collaborating, do you see this being overcome and more beneficial on smaller projects now with digital tools in general?
Yeah, I think from what I've seen, we don't have small projects, but we do have medium-sized projects, and I think, I think VisiLean works equally well on both. To be honest, to me, it's all about the participation of the guys on site with something like VisiLean or any lean software, where you need, it's the quality of the input. I do think going forward, you will probably find that smaller projects will be looking at this kind of technology more. Like I know for us, our subcontractors are probably not all as maybe sophisticated as we are, because they don't have the same kind of overheads and costs and budgets for initiatives and training and all that kind of thing. But they can see where they've been part of what we've been doing. They can see that there's real benefit in this kind of technology, and I think those smaller projects will be on board with this, going forward. Maybe not in the immediate term, but definitely it's now on the radar, I think, for those companies.
Okay. What do you see? What opportunities do you see emerging out of the crisis?
I think. I think for us in the Middle East, I think off-site manufacturing is probably an opportunity which might come to the fore now, because we're used to dealing with maybe complex designs that evolve during the lifetime of a job, and because of that, it's not necessarily facilitated off-site manufacturing or modular type manufacturing. I think it may, as a result of everybody using BIM and everything else, that we may start to look at getting more coordinated and mature designs prior to starting works on site, which would allow for a lot more off-site manufacturing. I think that could be an area of the market that could really pick up momentum in the Middle East.
Definitely, yeah. Where you can control things kind of in a bit more of a factory environment and kind of limit your risks, per se. I think this is the last one. Are there any impacts on contractual implications?
Yeah, well, I suppose each of our contracts are different on each job. So we generally use FIDIC in the Middle East, but there's a lot of not all the contracts treat something like COVID the same way, and even for our supply chain. So it's not necessarily a force majeure if it doesn't, it has to be be declared that way. And even then you have to prove that you couldn't come to work. So it's a difficult one. I think contracts going forward, people will look at those clauses a lot closer than they used to. No one ever really, looked at things where there'd be a global catastrophe that would bring the industry to its knees or stop manufacturing for 3 months. Those kind of things were never thought possible before. People will look at those a bit closer now, and I think it's hopefully that the industry realizes that the risk must be shared. You can't just dump it all on the contractor and the supply chain.
Yeah.
It must be shared with the client, and you'd be looking for a fair distribution of that risk in contracts going forward.
Perfect. That's it from today. I just want to thank you for taking the time out to join us, Kieran, and thanks everyone for joining us today. As I said, we're going to be starting this new webinar series where we're going to have different guests, different topics, and more to come from that today. So just want to sign off. Thanks again, Kieran.
Yeah, thanks, Seb. Thanks, everybody.
And see everyone later. Thank you so much.
Cheers, guys. Have a good weekend.
You too. Bye.